Hello, History 136 students. This brief video, pardon me, is going to be about propaganda. As you probably know, propaganda, also sometimes called false news or fake news, is showing up in the, well, news an awful lot lately. We may as well take a look at the origins of propaganda in American history. Before we do that, though, I need to remind you of something we've talked about before. That's the difference between a denotative meaning and a connotative meaning. The difference is a denotative meaning is the direct, literal dictionary definition of the word. The connotative meaning is that dictionary definition of a word plus a whole bunch of emotional baggage that comes, well, from history and from culture. A good example of this would be the words youthful, childlike, and childish. We use them very differently, but they have the exact same dictionary definition. Childish is generally seen as negative, while youthful is seen as a positive. And childlike might mean charming, or it might mean naive. The word propaganda is going to go through a very similar change in definition. Pardon me. So, literally, propaganda means a message intended to serve an agenda. In a technical and literal sense, every commercial you see on TV, literally every political message you've ever seen, are all propaganda. But in the U.S., and in the other countries that fought World War I, and I should note, interestingly, particularly in Germany, England, France, and the US, propaganda has a very negative connotation. During World War I, the literal book on propaganda was written by a man named Eli Havely, and he called it The Mobilization of Enthusiasm. And he defined it as having several several elements. One of them is patriotic themes. We'll get to that in a second. Another is demonizing the enemy, making an emotional or moral appeal, appealing to bandwagon, transferring or associating emotional feelings, and finally the censorship of news. In the U.S., the focus was very much on patriotic themes. And the U.S. was in some ways well behind the curve for propaganda, and yet very, very good at propaganda. The U.S. mostly used positive propaganda. That's the patriotic themes. The person who was most in charge of propaganda in the U.S. was a former muckraking reporter named George Creel. Creel was given control of his own department of the U.S. government, which he ran essentially by himself. He hired 75,000 essentially part-time workers, known as the 4-Minute Men. These men were trained to give very short, no more than 4-minute speeches, expressing the values of the U.S. and why the U.S. entered World War I. They would show up at virtually every meeting of every sort throughout the United States for the duration of the war. Pardon me. Whether it was a PTA meeting, a movie showing, a church, whatever, they would show up at pretty much everything. And he chose men from throughout the community so that they would be people from that community, from various ethnic groups, various walks of life, so it was someone that people knew in order to gain their trust. And they stressed ideas like that America was fighting to make the world safe for democracy. This was a very effective program. After the war, though, it left Americans feeling very used and very angry and mistrustful. Now, I always like to mention that during the Great War, most people didn't see very many movies, and so posters were a very popular and very widely used method of spreading propaganda. This particular poster is a Russian poster. And these had a common set of elements that people would be familiar with. In this particular one, you can see that, this head, because the distinctive spiked helmet, represents Germany. This head, Austria-Hungary, because of the hat. And this head with the fez, the Ottoman Turks, all Russia's enemies. It's also interesting to note that they're on the body of a hydra. Now, there is no separate word in Russian for hydra. There's only one word for dragon. And interestingly, the word for dragon and the word for devil is the same thing. They're pointing out in this particular poster that their enemies are not only different ethnically, they're different religions, giving the feeling of a holy war. This is a German poster used in both world wars. It very much gives a sense that the Germans are defending themselves, not attacking. This is a poster that was used both in the US and in England. It portrays Germany, you can tell by the spiked helmet, Germans as brutes, literal apes, subhuman. That's kind of washed out in this particular copy, but the monkey representing Germany is carrying off a young woman who looks distinctively like the Statue of Liberty. She represents, well, actually she gets a number of different things written on her. Sometimes she's Belgium, sometimes she's Liberty, sometimes she's freedom of the sea. This is another, this one's an English poster. Another distinctively American one. It's very popular in these to show Belgium as a woman being carried off by Germans. And then we get to a dark side of propaganda, if it's possible to be darker than demonizing your enemy. One of the things that was done in many countries was that false accusations or claims about atrocities were circulated. For example, in England, there were many stories of Belgian babies having their hands cut off circulated throughout England to drum up support for the war. In Canada, it actually took 70 years before it was admitted that German soldiers didn't crucify captured Canadians. Stories of crucified Canadians showed up throughout the media throughout World War I in Canada. The U.S. tended to stay a little bit more positive and try and appeal to patriotic themes very strongly. Abraham Lincoln showed up an awful lot in the posters of the era, but only if you're north of the Mason-Dixon line. There's also a lot of emphasis on things that people could do at home to try and bring the war home and give people a feeling that they're part of the fight. They also tied it into historical and religious motifs, as in this poster that ties the American Expeditionary Force to the Crusades. Not the best of ideas today. Here's another one that's a very common idea that if you're working, you're actually, even though you're not out fighting the war on the battlefield, work is also battle. And of course, tying it into Lady Liberty. Now, there is a very dark side to this mobilization of support, and that's suppression of dissent. In America, this took the form of the Espionage, Sabotage, and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918. They gave Congress sweeping powers to silence and imprison anyone who was a dissenter. It included punishments for speech criticizing the government or the military. It was used to repress organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World and the Socialist parties in the United States. It should be noted that this was a literal mirror of a similar act used in England and significantly less draconian than the act that was used in France, Italy, and similar acts in Germany. Russia's equivalent was vastly more vicious. So, before we go, think about this. The discussion question for next week is going to be asking you to look for a modern example of propaganda. I'll put up a post for this, and it'll be under the discussion questions, but take a while. As you're looking through the media, whether you're online or in the print media or on TV or on cable, wherever you're looking at media, take a look for something that's propaganda and just keep your eye out for it. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you later.